Yeah, well, good evening, everyone. It's 6 o'clock, so we will go ahead and get going. I believe that we are recording, so we should be good to go. Welcome to our first Monday session for PPA 535 Intergovernmental Relations. Hope that the coverage of the syllabus and all the course requirements that we went through on Saturday made sense to everyone, and everyone feels good about the course and what we are doing. I think just about everyone has already signed up for an article to lead a discussion on. So I think we're in really good shape from that perspective. And if you haven't yet, I think just about everyone has, but if you haven't, please do send me an email as soon as possible so you can sign up for an article and then you'll lead a discussion on that article. Tonight, what we are going to do is we're going to go over some of that information that was covered in 500, but do it a little bit more in depth. We'll talk about the constitutional foundation and the basis for federalism and intergovernmental relations. We will go through some slides and I'll go through some of the similar information that we talked about in 500, but again, do it a lot more in depth here. Talk about some of the different terms that we need to be familiar with when we study intergovernmental relations. Talk a bit about some of the different powers that are exclusive to the national government versus those exclusive to state governments versus those that are shared by both levels of government. We'll talk a bit about the development of federalism and where federalism came from. Look very briefly again at the Articles of Confederation, which you read in 500, and then the Constitution, but only the parts of the Constitution that really have direct bearing upon federalism and intergovernmental relations. So, not going to go through and pull apart the entire Constitution like before. We're just going to pull out those elements, those compromises between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists that really did shape our current system of American federalism and intergovernmental relations. Then also we'll take a look at two Federalist papers. We'll look at Federalist paper number 10, and Carrie Ann's going to lead our discussion on that. We'll look at Federalist paper number 39, and I'll take us through Federalist paper number 39, talking primarily about the differences between the Constitution as a national document versus a federal document. Then also tonight, we have three of our articles from the O'Toole textbook that are on our agenda. The Morton Grodson's article, which I'll talk about, the Deal Right article, which I'll talk about, but I'll probably incorporate the information from the Deal Right article into our discussion of the different eras of federalism. And then we have the Paradox of the Middle Tier article by Durthick, and then that discussion belongs to Sandra. And then that will get us through all of our constitutional and basic foundations information to get us started. And then next week, we'll move onward and upward and move into the political aspects of federalism and talk about some of the differences between treating federalism questions as constitutional questions versus political questions. So tonight, our primary focus is going to be on federalism as a constitutional issue. And when we deal with federalism as a constitutional issue, it means that the courts are a source for redress of grievance. And so if state governments disagree with federal use of power, if it's a constitutional issue, they can then take a constitutional case to the Supreme Court or work their way up the court system and eventually get to the Supreme Court. And we have an entire litany of Supreme Court cases that deal with the issue of federalism. If, however, federalism is considered to be a political issue, as it will be considered next week, then those avenues of going to the courts, those avenues are then blocked off for state and local governments. State and local governments, if it's a political issue, they then must seek a redress for their grievances politically. And you have to use political avenues as opposed to using the courts. So it's a very profound distinction that the court at certain times has made in terms of whether federalism is constitutional, which will allow a judicial redress, or if it's political, which would then require state and local governments to essentially play politics and to get in the world of lobbying Congress, much like a lot of our traditional interest groups tend to do. So next week will be political. Tonight is much more constitutionally focused. Before we get into our information, though, just a couple of really quick reminders. As I mentioned on Saturday, if you have not yet applied to graduate, follow those instructions in that July 10th email from Geraldine. You'll go into your single student sign-on, your SSO. Click on that chiclet to apply to graduate. You can apply to graduate directly there. If you haven't done it yet, you'll need to do it no later than tomorrow, October 15th, in order to graduate in spring 2025. If you don't do it by tomorrow, then you'll end up having to pay the university more money in a late fee. So if you haven't done it, please make sure to do it by tomorrow. Then the other quick reminder is that to get us started with our discussion board postings, our first Canvas essay, our first discussion board posting is due this coming Sunday on October the 20th. And for that one, as I introduced to you on Saturday, what you'll be doing is just from a general perspective, talking about the balance of power between national and state governments as that balance is embodied within the Constitution. So pulling from some of the information that we're going to cover tonight, that will be your first discussion board essay, not only a response to that initial prompt, but also responses to two of your classmates. It would really be beneficial if you could do your initial response sometime before Sunday, because then that gives people something to respond to. But all three of those posts, the initial and the two responses, all three of those posts must be submitted to discussion board no later than midnight on Sunday, October 20th. And then that will allow me to review the post and then bring any information into class next Monday if necessary. So that will get us started. Again, remember, if you are leading a discussion on an article or check that spreadsheet. And I think I have the most current spreadsheet up under the announcements on our Canvas site. If you look at that spreadsheet and you don't see your name on there, but you ask for an article, send me an email and we'll make sure we get that rectified. But hopefully everything should be correct on that most updated spreadsheet. So that's on our Canvas site. And remember, if you are going to do an article critique on an article, that article critique needs to be turned in before we discuss the article in class. And that spreadsheet then lists all the articles and the dates when we anticipate covering those articles. If anything changes along the way, I'll certainly let you know if I have to change the schedule. But for the most part, that's going to be the schedule of when the articles will be discussed. Article critiques get submitted before we discuss the articles. Okay, let's then, without further ado, get into some of this basic foundational information on American federalism and intergovernmental relations. And I think the first thing we really need to do is to clearly distinguish between what we consider to be constitutional federalism and what we consider to be intergovernmental relations. And as you probably remember from your 500 course, even though it was almost 2 years ago now, constitutional federalism looks at the relationship between national and state governments, because national and state governments are the only two levels of government that are discussed in the U.S. Constitution. So since they're the only two discussed in the U.S. Constitution, those are the two that embody this thing known as constitutional federalism. Once we start to add in local governments, then we transition from the term constitutional federalism to the term intergovernmental relations. So intergovernmental relations, the relationship between all three levels of government. Since local governments are not embodied within the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, all of their powers, all of their protections will come to them from either state constitutions or from state laws. So that's our third term there on the screen, Dillon's rule. And Dillon's rule says that local governments are creatures of the state. They are created by the state, they are empowered by the state, and the implication there is they can be destroyed. They can be taken out of existence by the state as well. So local governments don't have any federal constitutional standing. The only standing they have comes to them from what is provided to them in state constitutions or in state law. That's Dillon's rule, named after that Iowa judge from the 1800s. Another principle that we need to be aware of as we go through our discussion of American federalism is this thing known as the correspondence principle. The correspondence principle says that decision-making should correspond with the impact of the decision. So whichever level of government is being directly impacted by a decision, those levels of government should then be involved in the decision-making process. Also, those who are being impacted should also then have a role in paying for those decisions that they are making. So when you say that governments that are being impacted should be involved in decision making, you are inherently arguing for decentralization and devolution of power. And in this class, we do make a distinction between decentralization and devolution. Decentralization is allowing those state and local governments a seat at the decision-making table. So allowing them a role in decision-making. That's decentralizing decision-making. So that's decentralization. It is one thing to allow a state or local government a seat at the decision-making table through decentralization, and it's a completely different issue to provide them with the resources and the capabilities to carry out those decisions that they are making. Providing the resources is what's known as devolution. So whenever we devolve power, we are giving those resources to state and local governments to then carry out the decisions that they made through decentralization. Now, admittedly, decentralization and devolution oftentimes go hand in hand, and that's kind of the idea here in the correspondence principle. If we're saying that if a local government is directly impacted by this decision, they should then be permitted to be part of the decision-making process, we are talking about decentralizing decision-making. But just by decentralizing decision-making does not necessarily mean, by definition, that we are providing them the resources they need to carry out those decisions. That is more the issue of what's known as subsidiarity, another important term for American federalism. Subsidiarity says that parent government, such as the national government, will provide the resources necessary for state and local governments to carry out the decisions that they are making, or even to carry out the decisions that are being imposed upon them in terms of mandates. So subsidiarity is providing the resources and the capabilities for state and local subnational governments to carry out these policies and carry out these decisions. So correspondence argues for decentralization. Subsidiarity argues for devolution. And so as we can see, sometimes decentralization and devolution go hand in hand, much like they did in the new federalism approach of Richard Nixon in the 1960s and 1970s, and also the new federalism approach of President Reagan throughout the 1980s. And we'll talk about that later on as we go through those eras of federalism in a few more minutes. So I think it's important for us to kind of have a grasp on those 5 key terms to understand how our system of American federalism has developed and why our system looks the way in which it looks today. So we know that our system of federalism had its antecedents in the first Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. You had a chance to read those in 500. I provided a link to you here in this class as well to refresh your memory on the Articles of Confederation. As our first Constitution, we know that the Articles created much more of a confederacy as opposed to creating a federation. That's why they're called the Articles of Confederation. And the big difference between a confederation and a federation is that in a confederation, each of the component members, each of the participants, retain their own sovereignty. And their sovereignty often exceeds the sovereignty of this confederation as a whole. Clearly, the Articles of Confederation created a confederacy. Each individual state could select delegates to send to the Congress. And we know that this Congress in the Articles of Confederation, that was used similar to the term a meeting. So the states selected their own delegates, sent their delegates to go to this meeting, this Congress of the states, and then decisions would be made in this Congress of the states, this meeting of the states. If states didn't like what decisions were being made in this Congress of the states, as we know, they could just recall their delegates at any time. So they could just pick up their marbles and go back home and say, we are not going to play in this new government. We are not going to play in this new confederation. There was no true permanent Congress as an institution like we know it today. It was just Congress as a meeting of the states. There was also no true independent executive, that the executive came from this Congress of the states. So the states would select this president, if you will, and this president would come from that Congress of the state. So there was no independent executive, there is no independent judiciary. You essentially just had the state governments coming together in this meeting to make decisions. That was all underscored by this whole idea of this term of United States of America. The United States of America as a proper noun was used one time in the Articles. And when it was used when the Articles referred to the new Constitution as the style of this confederation shall be the United States of America, proper noun. That's the title. So basically just saying this confederation will be called United States of America. Every other time we refer to United States throughout the Articles Confederation, it is referred to as the United States in Congress assembled. Lowercase u, lowercase s, United States in Congress assembled. So these states are united together when they are in this Congress, in this meeting, to make decisions. So it's a much more temporary approach to any type of creation of a national government. So it did create a very weak national government, a weak national government that did not have a standing army or standing navy, a weak national government that had very little practical power over the regulation of commerce or the coining of currency or any of those types of basic functions that we think of today that the U.S. Congress currently has. So remember our discussion in 500, we said that the triggering event that led us to replace the Articles with the new Constitution was this idea of Shays' Rebellion. This real series of rebellions. It wasn't just one rebellion. It was a series of rebellions of farmers. And these rebellions of farmers were being led for the purpose of trying to help farmers keep their farms. They were being foreclosed upon. They weren't able to pay their debts. And so they were losing their farms. And so you had all these multiple rebellions going on. The most prominent rebellion was the one that was led by the retired Army Captain Daniel Shays. Hence the reason why in history it's been known as Shays' Rebellion. Since it took us so long, or it took the militia so long in Massachusetts to put down Shays' Rebellion, it really raised a lot of concerns about, is this confederation that we currently have in the Articles, is it strong enough to protect us from foreign invasion? Don't we need a stronger national defense? If we can't put down an insurrection of farmers, how are we going to put down a foreign invasion from a foreign nation? And so that was really the triggering event that led to the Constitutional Convention. And I think we had talked in our 500 class about, in this Constitutional Convention, we had three main conflicts, three main disagreements that were going on at the convention. The first one, the disagreement between small and large states. That disagreement was mediated. We came to a conclusion with the Connecticut Compromise, the Great Compromise, in that we will have a bicameral legislature, a House of Representatives that would be proportional representation, and a Senate that would be equal representation. House of Representatives, proportional representation to allay the concerns of large states, and equal representation Senate to allay the concerns of smaller states. Then we said we had a second major conflict between slave and non-slave states. This conflict, obviously, slave states, their economy was predicated upon the institution of slavery. They wanted to have slavery as an institution incorporated within the Constitution. We had several delegates at the convention that pushed back very hard on that, who did not want to put institution of slavery in the Constitution, because once you put the institution of slavery within the Constitution, then you are freezing it. And that's one of the things a lot of people don't understand about constitutions, is that when you put something in a constitution, you are essentially freezing it, and it becomes much more difficult to then undo that language. If you pass legislation, legislation is relatively easily undone. Constitutional amendments are not so easily undone. And so, you think about here in California, if we have a proposition like we do on the ballot coming up next month that will amend the California Constitution, then that language goes into the Constitution. You want to undo that language, you'd have to undo it with a future proposition, a future constitutional amendment that will then remove that Amendment language. And so it's a much more difficult process once you freeze something in the Constitution. And so fortunately, we had some delegates who pushed back effectively on including slavery as an institution in the Constitution. Unfortunately, however, we saw compromises made by the delegates that we ended up paying for and we're still paying for today. Things like the Three-Fifths Compromise in terms of representation, things such as the prohibition against banning the slave trade until at least the year 1808. Those were two of the compromises that were put into the Constitution to try and deal with this slave versus non-slave conflict. And again, that led us directly to the Civil War less than 100 years later, and many of the issues that we are still dealing with today in terms of the promotion of social justice and social equity. But the conflict that we really focus on here in this class is that conflict between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, because the way in which the compromises were designed in the Constitution to deal with this conflict between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, that is really what then shaped our current system of American federalism. So we know we had a group of delegates, the Federalists, led by people like Hamilton, and at that time, James Madison. We had Anti-Federalists who were led by people like Sherman. And the Federalists wanted a strong national government, a national government that not only could give us national defense, but also a national government that could regulate the economy. In terms of the Anti-Federalists, they only wanted to amend the Articles in order to provide stronger national defense, but they still wanted the states to remain sovereign entities. They still truly wanted a confederation. So I think as we discussed in 500, what had happened is a lot of the Federalist delegates had gotten to the convention first, and they really started the ball rolling downhill toward replacing the Articles with a brand new Constitution. The initial goal of the Constitutional Convention was not to create a new Constitution. The initial goal was just to amend the Articles. Because remember, one of the major problems with the Articles is that in order to amend the Articles, you had to have a unanimous vote. You had to have 13 out of 13 states agree in order to amend the Articles. It is next to impossible to get a unanimous vote on just about anything. So here, because you need that unanimous vote, that's why we had to have this Constitutional Convention to try and fix some of the flaws in the Articles of Confederation. So to kind of balance the interest between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, we had a series of compromises at the Constitutional Convention that were then embodied within this new Constitution. And so as Madison and Hamilton and other Federalists were able to convince the Anti-Federalists that they actually wanted more out of this new Constitution than just national defense, they were able to convince them that they wanted to get their debts repaid. And as we know, the delegates at the Constitutional Convention, they were white male property owners. As white male property owners, they were the creditors that loaned the money to make the Revolutionary War possible. Therefore, they were interested in getting their debts repaid. Well, in order to get their debts repaid, there has to be some centralizing force that will allow for that to happen. And that centralizing force would then have to be a national government that has some type of power over regulating economic activity. So since Madison and others were able to get the Anti-Federalists to agree that, yes, they wanted a national government that could regulate those aspects of commerce, that then really started that ball rolling downhill toward getting rid of the Articles and completely replacing them with this new Constitution. So we know this new Constitution was adopted, was ratified relatively quickly by many states, but New York was one of the major holdouts. And as we know, New York was the linchpin of commerce in the colonies, that most of the goods that flowed in across the Atlantic flowed into the port of New York. So if you didn't have the port of New York, you essentially had nothing in terms of economic flow of goods. And so we needed to get New York on board, which meant that we needed to appeal to the Anti-Federalists to convince the Anti-Federalists to support this new Constitution and get it ratified in the state of New York. And as we all know, the way in which we did that, we had the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and then we had the authorship of these 85 Federalist Papers, by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. In the creation of this Constitution, what the framers did is they put in a lot of compromises to try and ameliorate the concerns of the Federalists as well as the Anti-Federalists. So we're trying to kind of have it both ways. Whenever you have compromises and you try and have it both ways, it means that you're going to have some competing provisions within that Constitution. You're going to have some ambiguous language. You're going to have some sections of the Constitution that may seem to contradict other sections of the Constitution. That's what happens when you have a series of compromises. And that's exactly what the Constitution is. It is a series of compromises, not only between large and small states, not only between slave and non-slave states, but also between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. So as we discussed with the Constitution, we went through all the different articles in the Constitution. We know that one of the most important articles in the Constitution is the very first one. It's Article 1. And in Article 1 is where the framers discussed this new permanent Congress, this bicameral Congress made of a House of Representatives and a U.S. Senate. In Article 1, Section 8, they then laid out the enumerated powers, the specific powers that Congress has. Powers that we were all familiar with, such as the power to raise armies and navies, the power to declare war, the power to regulate trade between the states, the power to coin money, the power to publish counterfeiters, to publish piracy of the sea, to do all the established post offices, to encourage the arts and sciences, all those types of things are all laid out for us as the enumerated powers of Congress. By enumerating the powers, we are listing the specific things that Congress has the authority to do. Whenever you enumerate powers, whenever you list the specific things that an organization can do, the implication then is if a power is not listed, then it's not within the permissible power of that organization. So it can only do what is listed, what is enumerated as its powers in Article 1, Section 8. That obviously was a concession to the Anti-Federalists. That was meant to reassure the Anti-Federalists that these are the only things that Congress can do. Everything else will then fall with the states or with the people. So don't be too concerned. They have to adhere, Congress has to adhere to this very specific list of authorities that it's given here in Article 1, Section 8. However, as we also know with our reading of Article 1, Section 8, at the end of Article 1, Section 8, we have the elastic clause, sometimes known as a necessary and proper clause, that Congress shall make all laws necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested in it, blah, blah, blah. That elastic clause, that necessary and proper clause, essentially says, but Congress can then do anything it needs to do in order to carry out its enumerated powers. So take one of those enumerated powers, for instance. Look at the power of Congress to regulate commerce between the states. That's what's going to be known as the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. A lot of the Supreme Court cases subsequent to that have looked at the proper balance of power between national and state governments, a lot of those cases have been argued over the interpretation of that Commerce Clause, the power of Congress to regulate commerce between the states. Now, that's an enumerated power. However, Congress can do other things it needs to do in order to be able to regulate commerce between the states. So if Congress decides, for instance, that they want to require local law enforcement organizations to conduct and pay for background checks for gun licenses, the question then that went to the court was, is that within the necessary and proper requirement to allow them to carry out their ability to regulate interstate commerce? That came through in this case called the Prince versus U.S. case. In the Prince versus U.S. case, the Supreme Court basically said no. The Supreme Court basically said that is not connected closely enough to the Commerce Clause, to the power to regulate commerce, to allow Congress to require local law enforcement agencies to conduct and pay for background checks. It doesn't have a close enough connection to interstate commerce. Another really famous case in federalism was the Wickard versus Filburn case. In the Wickard versus Filburn case, it looked at a pretty pedestrian issue, such as the growing of wheat. And so you had a wheat farmer who was growing wheat and was producing more wheat than was allowed under federal law at that time. There was a federal law that limited the amount of wheat that could be sold across state boundaries in order to try and control the price of wheat. Well, this one farmer was growing more wheat than he was supposed to grow, but he wasn't selling it. He was growing it, he was keeping it on his farm. It was not crossing state boundaries, it was not part of interstate commerce. But in this Wickard versus Filburn case, and this was back in 1840s, the Supreme Court said it doesn't matter. At that time, the Supreme Court said you don't have to have that direct link to interstate commerce to allow Congress to impose these limitations on the production of wheat. And so at that point in time, the Supreme Court said it doesn't have to have that close, what they called nexus to interstate commerce. However, in 1997, in the Prince versus US case, they're saying it does have to have that close connection to interstate commerce. So the interpretation of this enumerated power and how it can be expanded with the elastic clause will depend upon the time period that we're looking at and the majority on the Supreme Court. I think recently we've all become very familiar with the importance of the majority on the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court in past years has been very deferential to their principle known as stare decisis, which is the respect for precedent. So in the past, typically what a Supreme Court majority would say is, we decided this case this way in the past, and so we are going to remain consistent. We're going to respect that precedent. We're going to respect stare decisis. Today, the Supreme Court is not all that concerned about stare decisis, and they are willing to then go in different directions than previous manifestations of the Supreme Court would go in. So that's just kind of an example of how, yes, you have these limited enumerated powers, but how those powers can be expanded will depend upon how the court interprets this elastic clause. Is this something that is necessary and proper for the regulation of interstate commerce? If yes, it is, then it's something that Congress can regulate. If no, it is not necessary and proper, then that should be beyond the powers of Congress for that enumerated power of regulating interstate commerce. So we had a nod to the Anti-Federalists by listing these powers specifically with the enumerated powers, but then we give a nod to the Federalists by putting in this elastic clause, this necessary and proper clause. And whenever Congress has expanded its powers over state governments, it typically has done so by taking an enumerated power such as the Commerce Clause and combining it with the elastic clause, which then gives it its basis for arguing, yes, it does have the ability to exercise this power over state governments. An even more stark contrast in terms of competing provisions comes to us from Article 6 of the Constitution as compared to the 10th Amendment to the Constitution. So we know in Article 6 of the Constitution, one of the primary clauses there is what's known as the Supremacy Clause, that the Constitution, laws, and treaties of the United States will be the supreme law of the land. So if a state constitution comes into conflict with the national constitution, the national constitution wins. If a state law comes into conflict with the national law wins. That was a big victory for the Federalists to get that put into Article 6 of the Constitution. However, it also raised alarm bells for a lot of these anti-federalists and was one of the primary reasons why anti-federalists refused to support the Constitution and refused to vote for ratification. So in response to that, we then end up with our Bill of Rights, our first 10 amendments to the Constitution, originally supposed to be 12 amendments, but ended up being 10 amendments because 2 of those amendments were not fully ratified. The amendment to limit the size of House districts to 50,000 was not ratified, so it did not become part of the Constitution. And then James Madison's limitation on the ability of Congress to increase its pay without standing for an intervening election, that was also not ratified at that time, but did not be ratified till 1992 as the 27th Amendment. But the other 10 of the 12 amendments that were proposed got ratified and became part of the Bill of Rights. We're very familiar with the 10th Amendment to the Constitution. 10th Amendment to the Constitution is the Reserve Powers Amendment, saying that any powers that are not provided to the national government, to the Congress, are then reserved for the states and or the people. So if it's a power that's not given to the national government and it has not been explicitly denied to the states in the Constitution, because remember in Article 1, once we get through Article 1, Section 8, we then go into a discussion of the limitations on what Congress can do in Article 1, Section 9, and then the limitations on what states can do in Article 1, Section 10. So there are some powers that are explicitly denied to state governments. So things such as coining money, that's specifically denied to state governments in Article 1, Section 10. We also know that treaty making is specifically denied as a power to state governments. So unless it's something like that that is explicitly denied in the Constitution, if it's not granted to Congress, then the powers are reserved for the states and or the people. So that Reserve Powers Amendment was put into the Bill of Rights in order to try and mollify the anti-federalists to get them to agree with and ratify this new Constitution. So the Supremacy Clause oftentimes runs head-on into the 10th Amendment. Enumerated powers oftentimes then run head-on into the Elastic Clause as well. And there are a lot of other examples, but those are the primary competing provisions that really form the basis of a lot of the federalism cases that we have seen come before the Supreme Court over the past 200 years. So based upon our reading of the Constitution, what are some of the powers that belong to the national government? What are some of the powers that belong to state governments? And then what are some of the powers that are shared between both levels? So in terms of the powers that are given to the national government, explicitly given to the national government are things such as the ability to coin money. Then we know at the time when the Constitution was adopted, we did have some different states that were still working with different currencies. And so you had merchants who weren't accepting currencies from different states. And so you had to have some uniform currency. In order to get a uniform, it had to be the power of the national government. So the national government Congress has the explicit enumerated power to coin money. Treaty making. Treaty making is another explicit power of the national government that is denied to state governments. And so as we know, presidents can enter into treaties. Those treaties are then subject to the ratification, the advice and consent of the Senate. And so what happens is that the president enters into a treaty. That treaty then goes to the Senate. That treaty then has to be ratified by the Senate. That gives the national government the sole power over official treaty making. Now, we have seen local governments and state governments go on these international trips and meet with leaders of foreign nations to come to agreements and alliances on climate issues and things such as that. But those are not official treaties. Official treaties have to go through the national level of government. And the very first treaty that was signed by President Washington was something that he thought would then go to the Senate and would be rubber stamped by the Senate very, very quickly. So much so that he actually hand delivered the treaty to the US Senate and then waited outside, waiting for the Senate to approve that treaty. He waited and the hours went by and the hours went by. And then a representative from the Senate came out and said, Mr. President, it may take us another day or two to ratify this treaty. We have to really take a look at it. We have to spend more time looking at it. Washington was offended by that, and he swore he would never go back and visit Congress again. He thought they would just be a rubber stamp. But the Senate really exerted itself very early on in saying, it's not going to be a rubber stamp. We're actually going to scrutinize these treaties before we approve them. But treaty making is the sole power of the national government. Regulation of commerce between the states. That is this enumerated power we've discussed in Article 1, Section 8. That is a primary power of the national government, a primary power of Congress. And that is, as we've said, one of the primary ways in which Congress has tried to expand its powers over state governments throughout our 200-year history of American federalism. Providing for an Army and Navy. And so only Congress may establish an Army and Navy and provide the compensation, provide the appropriations for an Army and a Navy. We know that only Congress may declare war. Presidents, if they want a declaration of war, they need to go before a joint session of Congress and get that declaration from a joint session of Congress. That happened in World War I, and that also happened in World War II. There was one member of Congress who voted against it both times, and that was Jeanette Rankin, voted against both World War I, and then was the only member to vote against a declaration of war in World War II. The issuing of patents, that is a national level power. Only the national government can issue patents. So we have a U.S. Patent Office for that. The admission of new states to the Union, that is a national government power alone. So if a state wants to break itself up into 2 or 3 different states, like California was talking about a few years ago, that's all well and good, but you can't officially become part of the United States as a new state unless Congress agrees to that. So that's a congressional function. And then, as we said, necessary and proper clause, the scholastic clause, the power to do anything necessary and proper to carry into execution those enumerated powers. Then for state governments, there are certain powers that are reserved for the states. One power reserved to the states is the power to create local governments. So local governments are created by the state. States have different ways in which they can create local governments. Oftentimes, in order to be incorporated as a local government, you need to meet certain constitutional requirements. And by constitution, I mean state constitutional requirements. So you have to have a certain population density, a certain number of people per square mile in order to qualify to become a local government. But the state establishes all that in the Constitution. States can make local governments, and then by implication, states can then also get rid of local governments if they would like to. And we have seen here in California movements by the state legislature to remove the incorporation from local governments, to unincorporate cities. And once a city becomes unincorporated, then it becomes under the auspices of the county. And then the county board of supervisors then has control over that area once it becomes unincorporated. States have the power to regulate commerce within their states. So intrastate commerce. Interstate commerce is the power of the national government. Intrastate commerce is the power of state government. But that's for commerce that's happening within the boundaries of their state. Conducting elections. So the Constitution primarily provides the responsibility for the conduct of elections to state governments. Now, there is a provision in Article 1, Section 8 that does say that Congress, for congressional elections, Congress can, at time whenever they want to, can come up with a law to supersede a state election law. But for the most part, state election laws are under the control of state governments. We had this Electoral Count Act in 1877 that was recently amended in 2022. And some of the changes to the Electoral Count Act that were initiated due to those changes in 2022 were done as a direct response to January 6th. And so those changes make it more difficult for Congress to throw out or challenge a list of electors, certified electors that have been sent by a state. So you know the way the Electoral College works is that in December, all the electors for the winning presidential candidate will meet in the state capitol. They will then cast their votes, and then there will be a certified list of those elector votes that will then be approved signed by the governor. And then those lists are then sent to Congress. Congress on January 6th then meets in joint session, and the vice president then reads those votes from each of the states. So in these revisions, it did make it more difficult for members of Congress to object to those certified list of electors from a state. Under the 1877 law, only one member of the House or one member of the Senate had to stand up and object in order for the House and the Senate to then grind to a halt and you then have debates and discussions over the validity of this state's list of electors. So it only took one vote in the House and one vote in the Senate. Now, under these revisions to the Electoral Count Act, today it takes 20% of members of the House or 20% of the members of the Senate in order to object to a state's list of electors. So it makes it very difficult compared to how it used to be, in the hope that we will avoid what happened on January 6th. And the second major thing that these revisions did is they made the role of the vice president in the counting of these electoral votes purely ceremonial. Because as you know, on January 6th, the Trump administration, or President Trump, wanted Vice President Pence to object to these slates of electors from these states like Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin and Georgia and Arizona. And he refused to do it, saying that his role was ceremonial. That's how that role has always been throughout history. But the Electoral Count Act of 1877 did not explicitly say that. Now, as a result of the 2022 law, it explicitly says that the role of the vice president is a purely ceremonial role. But we can see that as these reforms to the Electoral Count Act went through in 2022, they've provided more protection for state governments in terms of their slates of electors. So it becomes more difficult for Congress to object to those slates of electors. We know another power that belongs to state governments is the ratification of amendments. We know that amendments typically are proposed by 2/3 of the House and the Senate, and then ratified by 3/4 of state legislatures. But as we talked about in 500, that's only one of 4 ways of amending the Constitution. Amendments can also be proposed by 2/3 of the House and the Senate, and then ratified by 3/4 of state constitutional conventions. We know a third way is to have 2/3 of the states petition Congress for a national constitutional convention, and then any amendments that come out of that convention then get ratified by 3/4 of state legislatures. We know the fourth way is 2/3 of states petition Congress for a national constitutional convention, then any amendments that come out of that convention then get ratified by 3/4 of state constitutional conventions. But regardless of which of those 4 methods you use, there is still a role for states in ratifying those amendments, either by the state legislature or by state constitutional conventions. We have only used that first approach, 2/3 proposal by the House and the Senate, ratification by 3/4 of state legislatures, because that is the safer, the more reassuring way to do it. We know what happens when you have a constitutional convention. You can have a runaway convention like we had in our original constitutional convention that replaced the articles with a brand new constitution. That role for states in ratifying amendments to the Constitution is something that Madison talks a lot about in Federalist Paper number 39, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. And then obviously the 10th Amendment that reserves all powers that are not explicitly given to the national government nor deprived to the states, reserves those powers for the states and the people. Now, it is somewhat awkward language in the 10th Amendment because it says reserved for the states and the people. That raises a question, can people then operate independently of their state government? That's kind of an unresolved question. Typically, the Supreme Court, when it looks at cases dealing with the 10th Amendment, will be looking at reserve powers of the states. And is this something that belongs to state government as opposed to being a power that belongs to the national government? But then we also know that we have an overlap of power. And there are some powers that are shared by both national as well as state governments. One power is taxation. The federal government relies primarily upon the national income tax, the federal income tax, as their primary source of revenue. State governments rely upon state income taxes. They can also rely upon state sales taxes. Some can rely upon state property taxes. So they have a wider variety of taxes that they rely upon. And typically what we try and achieve is we try and achieve source separation, whereby we try and separate tax sources according to level of government. If you have a national sales tax, that national sales tax may start stepping on the toes of a state sales tax and may make it more difficult for states to use the sales tax, because every time you increase the sales tax, it has a price effect. So the overall price of the good goes up. If it's a very demand elastic type of good, as the price goes up, consumption will go down. If consumption goes down enough, then people just simply aren't buying the good anymore, which is no longer going to produce sales tax revenue. So we really try and separate these sources. Local governments tend to be most reliant upon property taxes, again, because of this idea of source separation. However, here in California, we know we have local option sales taxes, the Burns-Bradley Amendment types of taxes. So local governments also get sales tax revenue in addition to their property tax revenue. But here in California, they don't get the access to the income tax revenue like local governments in other states will. Some states, not just cities, have access to a local income tax. Also, special purpose governments, such as school districts, sewer districts, they also can levy their own local income tax. So it gets to be kind of confusing if you're in a state that has local income taxes, because some people work in one city and then live in another city. So they have to pay taxes, income taxes to both of those cities. And you have to then figure out how much time they spend in one city versus another. That's why a lot of those communities have joined forces into what we call RTAs, regional taxing authorities, whereby they will centralize the administration of income taxes. And so you have one form as a resident. So if you work in one city and you live in another, but both those cities are part of the same regional taxation authority, you have one form. And so it makes it a lot easier for people to report their income. The borrowing of money. We know the national government borrows a heck of a lot of money. We know that state and local governments borrow money as well. The national government borrows money every single year and usually is borrowing money because their revenues do not equal their expenditures. Each of those deficits in a given year and the money you borrow to cover those deficits then contributes to the overall national debt. State and local governments issue debt as well. They borrow money as well. Hopefully, they're borrowing money to build capital projects. So you need a new recreation center. You'll issue a bond for that recreation center. That is a good use of debt. Hopefully, they're not borrowing money to offset an imbalance between revenues and expenditures. However, we have seen that happen. Recently, in the last economic downturn here in the state of California, the state has a provision in the Constitution whereby it has to have a balanced budget. Revenues were far below expenditures. And so what the state did is it issued revenue anticipation notes saying we're going to borrow money and then repay that money once new property tax, once new income tax and sales tax revenue comes in the next fiscal year. And so the state was borrowing money to try and offset an operating deficit. The creation of courts. We have a federal court system and we have 50 different state court systems. The federal system was created by Congress with the exception of the Supreme Court, and then states can establish their own state court systems as well. It gets a little confusing because with having 50 different state court systems, they use different terminology. And so in New York, you may be talking about a New York Supreme Court that is not actually the Supreme Court of the state of New York. And so sometimes you have this different terminology between the states. And it's one of the things we get from federalism, a lot of fragmentation, which then leads to some confusion. And then obviously spending for the general welfare. That's a responsibility of all levels of government, a shared responsibility. So today we have these powers that are seen as national powers versus state powers versus powers that are shared between the different levels of government. But the arguments we've always gotten into in federalism has been who has the power over which issue at which point in time. And so as we had alluded to very briefly in our 500 course, our system of American federalism has gone through an evolutionary process and it's gone through several different phases. Most scholars will argue that the first phase was the phase of dual federalism, running from the founding of the nation, the Constitution, up through the beginning of the Civil War. This is what D.L. Wright, in his article in the O'Toole textbook, refers to as the coordinate authority model of federalism. National government has its sphere of influence, state government has its sphere of influence, and the two do not overlap with each other. They are separate spheres of influence, separate scope of duties between the national and the state government. In this early period of dual federalism, the sphere of influence for state governments was usually larger than the sphere of influence for the national government. And so state governments had more responsibilities than the national government had. Very famous Supreme Court case you're probably familiar with is McCulloch versus Maryland from 1819. In the McCulloch versus Maryland case, the Supreme Court had to essentially decide, could a state government tax an entity of a national government? So we had the Second Bank of the United States. The Second Bank of the United States had essentially what we call today, I guess, branch offices, but it had offices in different states. One of its offices was in the city of Baltimore, Maryland. The problem with that is that the state of Maryland had a law that allowed the state to tax all the fiscal notes that were issued by banks within state boundaries. Well, the second bank of the United States, a national bank, had an office that was within the state boundaries of the state of Maryland. So the state of Maryland applies its tax onto the fiscal notes issued by the second bank of the United States at that office in Baltimore, Maryland. You've got a constitutional question. So can a state government tax holdings or entities of the national government? In McCulloch versus Maryland, the court came to the conclusion of no. And the famous verbiage from the Supreme Court decision was the power to tax is equivalent to the power to destroy. That if we allow Maryland to tax the national government, we are essentially allowing the state of Maryland to destroy the national government and vice versa. So it established this principle that was known as reciprocal tax immunity. I'll put that in text chat. Reciprocal tax immunity. One level of government could not tax another level of government. That is really the embodiment of this idea of dual federalism and coordinate authority model of federalism. So the two are different authorities. They are separate from each other. They have their own separate sovereignty, and one cannot tax another one. So you have this coordinate authority model of federalism. Later on, we saw in the 1970s another important case that again tests this idea of the coordinate authority model. And that case is discussed by Deal Wright in his article, and that's this case called National League of Cities versus Usury. And that's a case from the 1970s. And in National League of Cities versus Usury, we had a situation where the national government, through the Fair Labor Standards Act, had imposed minimum wage requirements upon local governments, telling local governments, you have to abide by these federal minimum wage requirements under the Fair Labor Standards Act. Local governments obviously objected to that, saying that you cannot tell us what to pay our employees because what we pay our employees is an essential function of government. So you kind of have them arguing for this coordinate authority type of model. The Supreme Court agreed with state and local governments and said that is true. What you pay your employees is an essential function of government, and the national government cannot tell you as a state or local government how to do this essential function. That is, again, this violation of the separation between the different levels of government. So state and local governments got this kind of coordinate authority protection back again in National League of Cities versus Usury. But it did not last very long because there was then a follow-up case 11 years later called Garcia versus, I'll put it in text here, it's a long one, San Antonio. If I can type and talk, San Antonio Metropolitan Transit Authority. And I know I have a capitalization going on there, but Garcia versus San Antonio Metropolitan Transit Authority, otherwise known as Garcia versus SAMTA, S-A-M-T-A. And that was in 1985. Exact same case. The Fair Labor Standards Act was being reauthorized by Congress. And when Congress reauthorized it, they once again put in minimum wage requirements for state and local employees. So state and local governments then took their case right back up to the Supreme Court and said, you gave us protection in National League of Cities versus Usury, you need to give us protection again. This time the Supreme Court said no. The Supreme Court said, we were wrong in the 1970s when we said what you pay your employees is an essential function of government. We are justices. We are not local government officials. We don't know what is an essential function of local government. So therefore, we are going to overturn our own decision, our own precedent in National League of Cities. And instead of providing you with the constitutional protection of this kind of sovereign split between different levels of government, we are going to term this a political issue. And this is a political issue as opposed to a constitutional issue. So don't come to us asking for protection. Go out there and lobby Congress. So if you want to be protected against the Fair Labor Standards Act provisions, go and lobby Congress the next time they reauthorize it to get that provision removed. Because we are not going to provide you with judicial constitutional protection on this issue. So it just kind of underscores how the Supreme Court will look at this issue of coordinated authority model differently depending upon the issue, depending upon the era, and the composition of the Supreme Court. But going back to McCulloch versus Maryland in 1819, it really does further solidify this coordinate authority model of federalism, separate spheres of authority between the different levels of government. Now, as we'll see when we talk about the Morton Grodzins article, Morton Grodzins will disagree with this idea of dual federalism. Grodzins will make the argument and then give us some evidence as to why we have never had dual federalism, why there's always been an overlap between the different levels of government. But at least before the Civil War, there was a lot more separation between the levels of government than what we certainly see today. So this coordinated authority model of federalism really does characterize dual federalism, this separation between national and state governments. Then in the run-up to the Civil War, we see southern states objecting to a lot of the legislation that's coming out of Congress. Southern states were obviously trying to hold on to the institution of slavery as the basis of their economy. And so they saw Congress as being dominated by northern states. So when this legislation came out of Congress, they felt this legislation was unfair, that it was these northern states basically telling southern states how to conduct their business. So southern states pushed back on that, and they used a variety of different strategies to do so. So we know that one of the things they used was a strategy known as interposition, where they used all the resources at their disposal to try and slow walk, to try and slow down the implementation of these congressional laws that they disagreed with. When that didn't work, they then moved to a more extreme strategy known as nullification. In nullification, they would simply just declare this congressional law to be null and void. That Congress did not have the authority to pass this law, so therefore we're going to declare this law to just simply be null and void. Well, that only gets you so far. And they found that out. So once we get in 1861, we then have South Carolina secede from the Union, and then we have the domino effect. Tennessee and then all these other states southern states begin to secede from the Union. So their third strategy was then secession. So they then leave the Union, they form the Confederate States of America, and we have the bloody Civil War from 1861 to 1865. At the conclusion of the Civil War, when the North wins the Civil War, we then enter into the Reconstruction phase for the Southern states and the repatriation of bringing Southern states back into the Union. And as that process, hopefully everyone can hear me, as that process continued, then we saw kind of an erosion of state power. And we saw the national government start getting more and more involved in a lot of the functions that used to be seen as functions left to the state governments. So we saw the national government start doing things such as regulation of commerce. So the creation of the Interstate Commerce Commission. We see the federal government getting involved in the regulation of workplace safety. We see the federal government getting involved in the regulation of food quality and food safety, the safety and quality of pharmaceutical medication. So a lot of these things that used to be the domain of state governments now becomes the domain of the national government. And we kind of transitioned then after the Civil War from dual federalism into competitive federalism. In competitive federalism, state and national governments now start competing against each other for duties and responsibilities and authority. As they start competing with each other, you kind of look at this as like a zero-sum game, in that there's only so much authority out there in the world. And so whenever the national government expands its authority, it is doing so at the detriment of state government authority. So we start to see the state sphere of influence shrink, and we see the national sphere of influence, their circle, end up growing. It's still coordinated authority model because they are still relatively separate. It's just the national government is becoming much more pronounced in what it is doing. Then we have the Great Depression. As a response to the Great Depression, as we know, FDR comes in with all of his New Deal programs, ushers in a new era of federalism that we talked about in 500 called cooperative federalism, sometimes referred to as fiscal federalism. So these New Deal programs then really did demonstrate even more of an expansion of national government power through the creation of all these alphabet agencies and all these social services and social welfare programs. Well, there's a lot of pushback initially on all these New Deal programs. And a lot of that pushback was successful at the Supreme Court. So we saw case after case go into the Supreme Court challenging the constitutionality of all these national programs. We know that what FDR did is he responded to that with his court packing threat. And he then threatened to increase the size of the Supreme Court. And that threat, even though we can't really draw a direct correlation between that threat and a change in the decisions of the Supreme Court, after that threat was made, we then start to see the Supreme Court being much more accepting of a lot of these New Deal programs. And then the New Deal started to be seen by the Supreme Court as being constitutionally valid. A lot of these programs in the New Deal were based upon grants, federal grants that were being given to state governments to help pull them out of the throes of the Great Depression. It becomes a much more cooperative type of an approach. Once we move into the era of cooperative federalism, we then move into the model that D.L. Wright refers to as overlapping federalism. In the overlapping authority model of federalism, we now have our circles that start to overlap with each other. And that there are still some things that are the sole domain of the national government, still some things that state governments do, but there's a lot of functions that fall in that gray area where the two circles, the two spheres of influence overlap with each other. So this really ushers in this idea of the overlapping authority model and the use of money to then dictate the relationship between the different levels of government. As you know, we will spend an entire week talking about fiscal federalism in our third week together. And in our discussion of fiscal federalism, we'll get into a lot of the details about these different types of grants, a taxonomy of different types of grants, their advantages, their disadvantages, how they work, when they tend to work best, when they don't work all that well. And we'll get into a lot of the granular details in terms of a lot of these grants that underpin this era of cooperative fiscal federalism. After the assassination of JFK, we have Lyndon Baines Johnson becoming president. And Johnson was a big believer in centralization of decision-making. Johnson had his war on poverty. He had his Great Society. What he wanted to do is he wanted to really reduce the disparity in wealth from upper income Americans compared to lower income Americans. And he felt the way to do that is you do that through national government action. He also wanted to aggressively expand civil rights legislation. And we got the Civil Rights Act in 1964. We got the Voting Rights Act in 1965. We got the Fair Housing Act in 1968. The goal was to try and expand civil rights protections throughout these southern states. Well, there's a lot of distrust on the part of the national government when dealing with southern states because they've seen southern states use all these different strategies, these Jim Crow laws and these things like poll taxes that were eliminated in the 1960s as well, to try and limit the ability to vote on the part of people from underrepresented communities. And so he knew to expand civil rights, we could not rely upon state governments in Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana to do it. They were dragging their feet and actively pushing back on efforts like desegregation of schools. So he knew that there had to be a more centralized, coercive type of an approach to federalism in order to get this done. So in the Johnson administration, we usher in coercive creative federalism. Coercive creative federalism throughout the Johnson administration really starts to centralize decision-making at the national level of government and ushers in a new model, the third model discussed by D.L. Wright in his article, known as the inclusive authority model. And when you look at the Wright article, you'll see that he has these three concentric circles. The local government circle is subsumed within the state circle. The state circle is subsumed within the national circle of authority. So local governments are within the state and local governments are within the authority of the national government. All authority is inclusive within the authority of the national government. So that was the Johnson approach in coercive creative federalism. We had a lot of very specific categorical grants being used to make sure that state and local governments are using federal money the way in which they're supposed to use that federal money. We saw a lot of very restrictive mandates and direct orders being used, directly ordering state and local governments to take certain actions to further national objectives under the threat of criminal or civil punishment. So we see a lot of these very strict types of laws coming out of the national level. Nixon comes into office, and when he comes into office, he starts to undo a lot of this inclusive authority model, a lot of this creative coercive federalism. Nixon brings in with him this era of new federalism. The new federalism really is 1970s and 1980s. So you want to add 1970s to the 1980s. Nixon comes into the White House in January of 1969. When he comes in the office in 1969, he believes that the level of government that should be making decisions should be the state and local level. He believed that the level of government that should make decisions should be the level that is located closest to the people. They know what is in the best interest of their citizens, and citizens have a much more direct conduit, a much more direct line of contact to those local governments, as opposed to Washington, D.C., which is certainly far more distant from them. So he brought with him in his era of new federalism his 3Ds of federalism. And the 3Ds of federalism, two of them we talked about already. Decentralization is the first one. The second one is devolution of power. And the third one is deregulation. So not only to decentralize decision-making and have state and local governments involved, not only to devolve resources through subsidiarity to provide the resources to state and local governments to carry out decisions, but also deregulation, to remove what he considered to be these very onerous types of regulations and laws placed upon state and local governments as well as private industry to then free them up to make their own decisions and to be more entrepreneurial and be more creative. So through decentralization, devolution, and deregulation, he was turning a lot of functions back over to state and local governments. The problem from a subsidiarity perspective is that the money he was going to use to do this was money that would come from general revenue sharing. So what he proposed is through general revenue sharing, that the federal government would turn over a percentage of federal income tax revenue back to state and local governments with essentially very few to no strings attached. So we're going to give this money back to state and local governments. We are going to let state and local governments use this money as they see fit so they can make their own decisions. Decentralization and devolution. The problem with general revenue sharing is we had no revenue to share. So as you go out throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s, we ran a budget deficit every single year at the federal level, and that budget deficit continued to incrementally get bigger and bigger and bigger with each passing year. When your expenditures are outstripping your revenues, you have no revenue left over to share, and so general revenue sharing did not provide the resources necessary for devolution. When Ronald Reagan comes into office in 1981, he was a big believer in the Nixonian new federalism approach. What he wanted to do is when he came into office, he wanted to replace general revenue sharing, which wasn't working, with the use of block grants. So he believed that we should decentralize decision-making, but we should provide resources in the form of these block grants as opposed to general revenue sharing because there is no general revenue to share. So the Reagan administration actually eliminated federal general revenue sharing in 1986. So as we'll talk about when we talk about fiscal federalism, the Reagan administration was very famous for taking a lot of these very specific categorical grants from the Johnson administration, 187 of them, and combining them all together into 13 general block grants, so that state governments could have their own flexibility and latitude in determining how to use that money. They didn't have to use it exactly how the national government told them to use it. The problem is it was a bittersweet pill for a lot of state and local governments to swallow. They love the flexibility they got with block grants. They hated the fact that as these categorical grants were combined into block grants, the Reagan administration also took away some of the funding. So they got more flexibility, but they got less money. So they got more decentralization, but they got less devolution of resources. So this new federalism era is just like what we saw with Nixon, except a different tool being used, block grants as opposed to general revenue sharing. We saw new federalism throughout the Reagan administration into the George H.W. Bush administration. Then once we start to get into the Bush administration, especially into the Clinton administration, throughout the late 80s and into the early 90s, we really start to shift into another era of federalism, I like to refer to as contextual federalism, whereby the relationship between different levels of government is dictated not necessarily by ideology, but rather dictated by issue. So we need to know the issue before we know what our approach will be to the proper balance of power. So we saw in the Clinton administration that the Clinton administration took a very issue-based approach. So with something like welfare reform, the Clinton administration bought into devolution and decentralization. So he got rid of AFDC grants and replaced them with temporary assistance and needy family grants, or TANF grants. We're replacing categorical specific grants with block grants to provide a lot more flexibility to state governments in terms of how they want to spend those TANF grants. They could spend those TANF grants pretty much however they wanted, as long as the result was moving people from welfare into gainful employment. That was your goal, to move people from welfare to work. So if you use them on childcare programs, that was fine as long as it moved people into the workforce. If you want to use them on computer literacy programs or job seeking programs, you could use it on those programs as long as it moved people from welfare into work. That was a very new federalism, decentralization, devolution type of an approach. His approach in terms of drunk driving laws was very centralizing. I think we mentioned this in 500, where he wanted a national blood alcohol content level of 0.08. The national blood alcohol content level of 0.08 was not shared in all the states. There's no constitutional provision that says that the national government can dictate a blood alcohol content level of 0.08 for drunk driving laws. So what he did is instead he used these things called crossover mandates, where he threatened states and said, if you don't adopt a state-imposed 0.08 blood alcohol content level, I am going to take highway funds away from you. That was a very centralizing approach. It was successful, and that states, because they didn't want to keep losing money, they went ahead and they adopted that 0.08 level. And so it's pretty much as a level that we see across pretty much the entire country today. That was a very centralizing approach when it came to that type of policy issue. Look at the Bush administration. In the Bush administration, we had a very centralizing approach in terms of No Child Left Behind, where No Child Left Behind, the national government would establish these standards, these proficiency standards, and then require that school districts and state governments would work toward having 100% proficiency for all their subgroups of populations. And then eventually, if you couldn't get to that 100% proficiency level, then you would end up risking losing national education money. So that was a very centralizing type of approach. However, for most other policy issues in the Bush administration, it was much more in alignment with new federalism and decentralization and devolution. Look at the Obama administration. In the Obama administration, we saw a lot of national government action. We saw the use of things like executive orders and presidential signing statements in order to induce actions by state and local governments, so a very centralizing approach. But in some other issues, such as marijuana law, we saw a very hands-off, very decentralizing approach, where a lot of federalism authors will make the argument that the Obama administration used an approach of nuanced federalism, where they would decide intentionally not to enforce federal marijuana law and allow states to kind of do what they want to do in terms of the allowing of the medical as well as the recreational use of marijuana. And so they kind of look the other way from federal law perspective and let the states kind of do what they want. A decentralizing kind of new federalism type of an approach. And so we see this happen in a lot of administrations. So it's not as much, is the president Democrat or Republican? Is Congress controlled by the Democrats or Republicans? It's not as much ideology as it is context of the situation, the actual issue itself. The problem with the actual issue itself is that it makes it a much more complicated process to study and understand federalism. It was relatively simple when we knew that a federalism approach would be predicated upon political ideology. You could then predict what different administrations and different majorities in Congress and state legislatures would do. Now that it's more issue specific, we have to actually drill down to the issue, look at the issue network of all the stakeholders who are involved in that issue to better predict and understand, will it be a more centralizing approach or a more decentralizing approach? So it has muddied the waters of studying federalism, but I think this contextual approach is the most accurate way in which we study American federalism today. But the takeaway from this discussion is that federalism is a dynamic concept. It is not only going to vary depending upon the issue, it's going to vary depending upon the period of time in which we are looking. There are some decisions from the early 1800s that are completely different than other decisions in the 1960s or in the 1970s or the 1980s. And we have seen the Supreme Court do a complete 180-degree turnaround in terms of issues in a matter of a decade, depending upon how the majority composition on that court has changed. The ultimate arbiter of these decisions, of all these compromises that have been incorporated within the Constitution, is the Supreme Court. And so the Supreme Court is the one that oftentimes will decide, is this law from Congress constitutional, or does it violate the assumptions within the Constitution? So that is a very brief overview of some of the basic foundational principles that underpin our current system of American federalism. And this is kind of the lecture component of the course. What we do from here is we now kind of turn the course more into a graduate seminar, where we will start looking at a lot of these articles in the O'Toole textbook and the articles on the Canvas site, and getting into discussions on what these articles mean, and then hopefully updating some of these articles so that they better match what we are currently seeing today in contemporary federalism. So the first, I guess, quote unquote, article that we look at is going to be Federalist Paper number 10. I know that's the one that Carrie Ann has. So give me 1 second, Carrie Ann, and let me, in case you have slides that you want to share, and I know that you did upload some slides to the Canvas site. So let me go ahead and make you a co-host to make sure that you have ample, oh, that's the wrong, hold on. My cursor moved and I clicked on the wrong name. So where are you at? There you go. Okay, 1 second. Okay. All right, Carrie Ann, you are now our co-host, so you should have access to the sharing of your slides. And so I will turn it over to you to lead a discussion of Madison's Federalist number 10.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. And sorry about my camera. I'm having some issues on my Mac. Let's see. Okay. So I'm going to be talking about Federalist Paper number 10. And I just wanted to provide a brief background. I know Dr. Powell already talked about some of this tonight, but the Federalist Papers were written by Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison to promote the ratification of the Constitution. So they were in favor of a strong central government, and James Madison wrote Federalist Paper number 10 in 1787. And this paper focuses on the issue and dangers of factions and their impact on government. So what are factions? Madison defined a faction as a group of citizens, whether a majority or minority, driven by shared passions or interests that conflict with the rights of others or the broader community's welfare. So some examples are economic interests, political beliefs, or social issues. Madison also talked about the causes of factions, and he argued that factions are inherent in human nature itself. And he said that people will always be divided into groups based on their different interests, beliefs, and circumstances. And he also mentioned a few key areas where these divisions arise. So the first is through religious and political opinions, attachment to leaders, and personal interests, such as differences in economic status. And he also talked about the most significant cause of factions, which he believed is the unequal distribution of property. And Madison also talked about the role of government and how he believed it must manage these different and competing interests. And he said that the task of legislation is to regulate these interests and to try to balance them in a way that minimizes conflict. However, he knew that this process inevitably involved the spirit of a party or a faction, since government decisions often favor one group over another. And he also argued that allowing lawmakers to act as both judges and parties in legislative matters creates a conflict of interest. And when legislators pass laws on issues such as debt, trade, or taxes, they're often representing groups with specific interests, and these interests can bias their decisions. So as a result, he said that the majority faction is likely to dominate and pass laws that serve their own interest, even if those laws are unjust or unfair to others. And he believed that there's a strong need for a system that can manage and balance these competing interests fairly. And with that, we have our first discussion question. So as I just mentioned, Madison believed that one of the primary goals of government is to regulate the various and conflicting interests in society. So what mechanisms are in place today to manage competing interests in government?
I would say the filibuster in the Senate that requires 60 votes to pass non-budgetary legislation. It's theoretically supposed to ensure that the two parties are working together in order to pass legislation through the Senate.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I also thought of the separation of powers and how each branch has its own distinct responsibilities, which creates a system of checks and balances. So this prevents one group or faction from dominating the government and ensures that competing interests are balanced across different areas of governance. Does anyone else have any ideas or any input? If not, I can move on to the next slide. Let's see. Okay, so and then my next discussion question is, can you think of any current examples where factions have significantly influenced government policy or social movements?
Hi, Carrie Ann. I would say that the Federalist Society and their influence on the U.S. court system is a good example of a faction that has done this.
Yeah, that's another great point. Does anyone else have any examples?
I
So
can think of
one, oh, sorry, go ahead.
sorry, Carrie, and I was going to say I can think of a couple of them. I guess the more prominent one would be gun control, and then there's also always that issue with healthcare reform, just to name a couple.
Yeah, and I feel like the gun control debate is something that's really prevalent in our society today. And another one that I thought of is the faction advocating for reproductive rights. So we have like our pro-choice activists and our pro-life factions. And especially with the overturning of Roe versus Wade in 2022, that's led to the restriction or banning of abortion in many states. And that's also really prevalent in our society today. Okay, so Madison talked about two ways to control factions. The first is by removing the causes, and the second is by controlling their effects. And the first approach he talked about with removing the causes is destroying liberty. So in Federalist Paper number 10, Madison said, liberty is to faction what air is to fire. So by this, he meant just as air fuels fire, liberty fuels factions. And in a free society, he believed that people will inevitably have different opinions, interests, and passions, which will naturally lead to the formation of factions. And he believed that liberty gives people the ability to express and pursue their interests. And he also argued that the elimination of liberty would destroy the foundation of democratic governance. And the second approach that Madison mentioned, by removing the causes, is to give every citizen the same opinions, the same passions, and the same interests, which he believed is unrealistic and impractical because he felt that human reasoning and self-interest naturally lead to diverse viewpoints. So he said that instead of suppressing these natural differences, he said the government should focus on protecting individuals' rights to exercise their diverse faculties. So what are some of the ways we can control the effects of factions today? Amanda?
I feel like recently, I think it's because there's a proposed law coming up in regards to especially like social media and defining like I guess I think it has to do kind of with like it's aimed at trying to like control misinformation, right? And obviously a lot of people have concerns about that limiting free speech, but I feel like that's starting to come to the forefront of trying to control a lot of the misinformation online, specifically from like those far left, far right factions, the more extreme ends of the spectrum. But we're kind of in the middle of like that happening and figuring out the best way to do that without eliminating or controlling free speech and keeping it free. So I think that'll be interesting to see how if they're able to even control that in a way that still allows for that. Which I'm not super optimistic about it, but we'll see.
Yeah, and especially on social media, like you said, there's so much misinformation and differing opinions on the media. Um, but I didn't know about that. I didn't know there was like potentially a law that was going to be passed. So that's pretty interesting. Emily?
Yeah, just to kind of bounce off what Amanda was saying, I actually read an interesting article today that was talking about incorporating this into education, and just helping students navigate their way through all of these different platforms and how to determine or basically vet sources, because there's, as we've all talked about, there's such a plethora of them available today. So I think bringing that into from an educational aspect could maybe help with that as well.
Yeah, education is definitely important. It's important to like encourage informed and active citizen participation, and this can definitely help control the effects of factions. Okay. So Madison came up with the solution, a large republic, but first he criticizes pure democracies and how they're unstable and vulnerable to factionalism because there are no safeguards to protect minority rights. So he said that the structure of a pure democracy allows for majority factions to oppress others, leading to conflict and undermining personal and property security because decisions are made by popular vote without representation. And he also said that in this system, there are no institutional filters to moderate the passions or self-interest of the public. So this is why he believed a republic with this system of representation and structural checks is a better form of government for managing the effects of factions. And he explained that in a republic, the government is delegated to a small group of representatives, which sets it apart from a pure democracy where citizens govern directly. And he said that this representation allows for the refinement of public views as elected officials are more likely to pursue the public good than the people themselves might. He also acknowledged the potential for representatives to act against the people's interests due to factionalism and corruption. But he did argue that a larger republic, one with a greater number of citizens in a broader geographic area, provides better safeguards against these dangers. And he said that a larger republic offers a greater pool of qualified candidates, increasing the likelihood of electing fit representatives. And he said that each representative is chosen by more citizens in a larger republic, which makes it harder for corrupt candidates to succeed, making elections more likely to favor individuals with genuine merit. So he praised the federal system in the US Constitution for striking a balance by assigning national matters to the federal government and local matters to state legislatures, ensuring both broad and specific interests are addressed. So how do you think advances in technology such as social media might enhance or challenge the effectiveness of a republic? I know we kind of touched on this a little bit, but.
Hey, Carrie Ann, I don't know how to raise my hand, so sorry if
Oh, go
sorry
ahead.
if
Yeah.
someone else wanted to go. I think maybe one of them is on in terms of how it challenges it. I know on me and my wife, like the algorithms are different. So sometimes like I get specific things on my feed, and then in terms of the comments too, I find that the comments are really directed towards what I'm looking at, and versus her screen or her phone, it's completely different than what's on her feed. So what's actually happening out in the world may be delivered different to me than it is to her. So yeah.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And algorithms are definitely designed to boost engagement, but as I'm on social media a lot, so like for me, like I only see the views that I already agree with. So yeah, but algorithms is definitely a great point. Does anyone else have anything?
Well, oh, sorry. I should have raised my hand, but I was just going to say there's opportunities for a lot and maybe too much information because of social media and hard to wade through all the info.
Yeah, and as I said earlier too, like, and you're saying there's a lot of misinformation on social media, but it also can be a great tool because there is so much information out there. So if you're able to locate the right resources, it's definitely a good educational tool. And I saw there were a couple hands raised, but I couldn't see whose.
Oh, well, I was just going to say on a more positive side, I do think that social media allows candidates to get their message out in new and unique ways. For example, there's a lot of podcast interviews happening right now in the current election, which I think is relatively new to this election cycle that we're having right now. And so it allows them to have tailored messages to specific audiences, I think, in a way that wasn't necessarily available in a more traditional media environment.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I saw Kamala Harris went on a podcast recently to talk about reproductive rights. So I thought that was really interesting. Um, but yeah, like media and technology is definitely a great tool for citizens to engage um, with candidates. Did someone else have their hand raised?
I did. I just wanted to add in something specific to how I've been using, technological advances. For example, there's a lot of government sites that have a lot of really useful information for citizens to understand really complex rules, regulations, just information, or even how government is structured. That is quite helpful for the public to be more informed and to make better choices.
Yeah, that's a great point, Heidi. And then I saw one, Boo, was it you had your hand raised?
Yeah, Carrie, and I was going to say, if there's anything that's like for me at least, AI is causing a lot more confusion because some of the videos that are generated right now, I like there's some instances where you can't even tell if that's the actual person doing the speaking or if it's an AI video that's being generated by someone else that's causing disinformation. So for me, I guess, and for some people at my work also, it's been creating a little bit more confusion. So that's just my take on it.
Yeah, I've noticed that a lot too. And it is pretty confusing at times. So that's a great point. Is there anyone else? Okay, and that's it. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Carrie Ann. Well done and good engagement and conversation. I think those are a lot of great points. And I do think, one of the things that we see that's different today as compared to in Madison's time is the difference in resources between these groups and these factions. I don't know if Madison and the framers really thought that you would have this disparity in resources between these different groups. And I like the conversation about the access to information and the impact of artificial intelligence. And information is a resource. And so usually when you think about this disparity in resources between groups, we think about money. And so obviously there are groups, NRA and some other groups that have a AARP who have a lot of money that they can go out there and use that money to try and foster their policy perspectives. And there are some other groups that obviously lack those resources. And it makes it a little bit more difficult. But resources really goes well beyond money, and it goes into information. And I do agree with all of you who said that, information is a major issue in the future. There's so much information, it's ubiquitous, it surrounds us every single day. our ability to determine what is credible information versus what is not credible information, that is going to be central to how we control factions and how we balance groups against groups. And I think that it's becoming more and more difficult, as was mentioned with AI, when you have videos that are generated that look so realistic, you question everything. And even if it is a real video of someone, you're not sure that's a real video, and you have to really dig very deep and be able to really validate that information. Unfortunately, some folks don't have the resources to be able to dig deep and validate that information. And then there's also the question of being inattentive. And, some voters don't want to put the time into doing that. And so I think that's going to be a major issue, that the resources are, even songs, it is scary. Yeah, I can create whatever kind of song you ask it to create. And so becomes very, very difficult when you do have differences in resources, but those resources are not just measured in dollars and cents. They're measured in information and the ability of groups and individuals to determine what information to base decisions on and what information to disregard. So, but very well done. I know we did Federalist 10 in the 500 class, and so this is just a much deeper dive into it here in this class. And thank you, Carrie Ann. Very well done. That's kind of the way in which these discussions are supposed to go. So thank you for getting us off to a very good start. I do see that it is 7:40, so let's go ahead and take a quick break. Let's take about a 10-minute break, if that's okay. Come on back at 7:50. When you come back at 7:50, I'll talk a little bit about Federalist Paper number 39 and what it means for our understanding of federalism. Then we'll get into the 3 articles that are in the O'Toole textbook, and then that will wrap it up for the evening. So come back at 7:50 and we'll talk Federalist number 39. Okay, welcome back, everyone. 7:50. So let's finish up our articles for tonight. And I'll just quickly talk a little bit about Federalist number 39, because as we know, these 85 Federalist Papers were all written to try and get the ratification done of the Constitution and convince citizens in New York to support the Constitution. So they were written in a way to really kind of sell this Constitution. Say, don't fear it, but rather you should support it because it's nothing that you haven't seen before. It's nothing that's going to create too strong of a national government. So it really was very much of a sales pitch. And I think you see that sales pitch very clearly in Madison's Federalist number 39. And so, he starts out talking about how don't fear it because we've seen this type of government before in other nations. But I think one of the more compelling ways in which he sells it is by telling people to look at your own states. Look at your own state constitutions, look at your own state governments, and you're going to see a lot of similarities between this new government at the national level and what you currently see in many of your states. And so says things such as, he says, on page 91, let's compare this Constitution to what you have in your states. He says, so for instance, you think about the House of Representatives. The House, like that of the branch or at least all of the state legislatures, is elected immediately by the great body of the people. So people are electing members of the House just like people are electing members of at least one House in the state legislature in your state. The Senate, by contrast, is like the Senate of Maryland. It derives its appointment indirectly from the people. Now, I don't know if that's as compelling of an argument. It's one thing to say that the House is like what you see in all of your states. But then for the Senate, he's basically saying, well, it's kind of like what you see in Maryland. Well, that might be convincing for residents of Maryland. I don't know how convincing it is for residents of other states that don't have an indirect selection of members of their state legislatures. He says, look at the president. The way in which the president is selected is indirect, an indirect choice of the people. And says that that's something that we're familiar with in our states as well, with what he calls our chief magistrates. He says the House of Representatives, people who serve in the House of Representatives will be serving for a period of 2 years. He said, well, that's the same as what you see in like the state of South Carolina. The Senate, he says, is elected for a period of 6 years, which is but 1 year more than the period of the state of Maryland, and but 2 more than that in the states of New York and Virginia. Now, again, I don't know if that's the most convincing argument to make because he's pointing out that the 6-year term is long. It is longer than what you see in these states. And by saying that it's only 2 years more than what you see in the Senates of New York and Virginia, that's a big difference between 4 years and 6 years. So I don't know if there's a whole lot of compelling evidence that he provides for us as to why that 6-year term in the Senate is something that you should not be concerned about. But at least that's his attempt. Because you've seen this in your states, you're seeing it again at the national level. It's nothing too novel, nothing too new, nothing for you to be afraid of. I think the most useful part of his discussion is when he deconstructs the Constitution into its component elements. So he says, first off, let's look at the foundation of this Constitution. The foundation of the Constitution comes from the states. And so his goal here is to ask the question, and you know exactly how he's going to answer it. Is this Constitution federal or is this Constitution national? Obviously, if he wants to sell this to the anti-federalists, he is going to want to make the argument that it's more federal than it is national. And we've talked about this before is in 500 is that the language used by the framers is different than the language we use today. So when you have Madison talk about the term federal, when he says federal, what he means by federal is more what we would call a confederation today. So by federal, he means sovereign states. So states that maintain some element of their sovereignty. So when he says federal, he's really talking more about what we would say as confederal. National would mean the power resides at the national level. So federal, the power resides with the states. National, the power resides with the national government. So his goal is to show that this new constitution is not a wholly national constitution, but rather that it's probably more federal than it is national. So I said, let's look at the foundation, how this constitution, how this union was established. This constitution, this union was established by the states. In order to ratify this new constitution, it had to be ratified by 9 out of 13 states. If you don't get 9 out of 13 states to ratify it, the constitution does not go into effect. So essentially, he's making the argument the states are creating the constitution. That's a dangerous argument that 70 years later would be used for the Civil War. And so states' rights advocates, secessionists, would make the argument, well, just like Madison said in Federalist 39, we states created the Union, we created the Constitution. So if we want to withdraw from the Constitution, withdraw from the Union, we can do that. And so he kind of laid those seeds unintentionally for the states' rights argument that will be used later on in the lead up to the Civil War. But he says the states created the Constitution. So that makes it much more federal as opposed to national in nature. He says, let's look at the power source. Where does the power come from? He says for the House of Representatives, the power is more national in nature. It's more national because members of the House are being elected directly by the people. So that makes it more national. However, representatives in the Senate are selected by state legislatures. And until we had that change in the 17th Amendment, all senators were selected by state legislatures. So that is a much more indirect selection. That's a more federal approach to selecting senators. In terms of the president, we kind of have a mixture of the two. We've got this electoral college. The electoral college is loosely based upon popular vote, but in order to become president, you have to win a majority of the electoral college. That's an indirect selection, and so that's a little bit more federal in nature. So the House of Representatives is national, the Senate is federal. The president is kind of a combination of the two, probably leaning a little bit more federal than national. Then he says, let's look at the operation of the government, the daily operations of the government. In the daily operations of the government, he throws his hands up and says it's national because the daily operation of the government will be done by these bureaucrats, these individuals. Since it's being done by individuals and not being done by states, it's going to be more national in nature. He says, well, let's look at the extent of power and the extent of power of this new national government. There are some powers that are given to the national government, but there are a lot of other powers that are reserved for the states. So therefore, it's a mixture of the two. It's not purely national. It's also not purely federal. He says we've got these enumerated powers in Article 1, Section 8. Those enumerated powers then leave a lot of powers to state governments, and that's why you then have this federal as well as national component to the extent of powers. Well, how is the Constitution amended? Well, the Constitution Amendment, we've talked about how you amend it before. There is a pronounced role for state governments in that states must ratify, 3/4 of states must ratify this Constitution. So therefore, it is very federal in nature in that the states have a role to play in the ratification of all these amendments to the Constitution. So essentially what he is saying is we take the whole thing together. We look at this entire Constitution. It is neither wholly national nor is it wholly federal. It is a rational combination of the two worlds. But I think when you read between the lines and reading Federalist 39, you can still see that he is really trying to lead you down the road that yes, it's a combination of the two, but if he had to choose one, you would certainly choose federal over national in terms of the nature of this new Constitution. So I think, again, why I have you read 39 is I think it's a good microcosm. And it really does encapsulate a lot of the arguments that Hamilton, Madison, and Jay made in the Federalist Papers for the purpose of convincing people, especially the anti-federalists and people in New York, to support this Constitution. Don't fear it. It's not a wholly national. There are a lot of federal components that will provide power and authority for the states. So I think it's a really nice microcosm of the entire 85 Federalist Papers. Then the other article, we have two other articles that were assigned for this week. We've already dealt with the Deal Right one, so I don't think we need to go through that again. We talked about that when our discussion of the evolution of federalism. But the other two articles we have, the Morton Grodzins articles on the article on the federal system, and then the Durthick article on the paradox of the middle tier. So let me talk to you just for a couple minutes about the Grodzins article on the federal system, and then I'll turn it over to Sandra to talk more and lead a discussion about the paradox of the middle tier article. But in terms of the Grodzins article, Morton Grodzins is one of these people who used to publish a lot in the area of federalism. He is one of these heavy hitters in federalism. He and his student, Daniel Elazar, oftentimes published a lot of federalism articles together. He and Elazar came to the conclusion that our discussion of the evolution of the eras of federalism, that discussion is wrong. And he made the argument that there was never this era of dual federalism. Our federal system, according to Grodzins, has always been one of overlapping authority. There's never been a coordinate authority. It's always been overlapping authority. The functions of national and state governments have always overlapped with each other. And the example that he uses to start his article is the example of what he refers to as a sanitarian. And this type of position is basically what we would call today a health officer. And so he says, for this health officer, we can look at this one position and it can give us a good example of all the overlap that goes on between the different levels of government. So he says, let's take a look at this health officer, this sanitarian. And the sanitarian, the health officer, he has to apply standards that come from the national government. So he's applying rules and standards provided to him by the national government. Then he says his base salary comes jointly from state and federal funds. So his salary is paid for by both the state government as well as by the national government. The county, however, provides him with an office and office amenities and also pays a portion of his expenses. So he's got money coming from the local level in terms of his office, his amenities, and his expenses coming from the county. And the largest city in the county also contributes to his salary and office by virtue of his appointment as a city plumbing inspector. So he's basically saying we've got all three levels of government, and even at the local level, different types of local governments that are contributing to this one position of sanitarian, this one position of a health officer. When you look at current positions today, we see this very frequently, where positions are paid for through a combination of federal, state, and local resources. When I was on a school board, we had a position that was running the special ed authority, the special education authority. And that position was a position that implemented federal education law in terms of special education. So they were implementing laws from the federal government, but they were also implementing laws from state government as well. The state government provided some reimbursement for the salary of this individual, but the remainder of the salary for this individual was split between the local school districts that this person worked in. And so we had 4 different school districts in the valley, and each of the school districts was part of this authority, and they all provided some reimbursement then for the salary of this person. This person then had an office in one of the school districts, so the office and the office amenities provided by that one singular school district. So it's a good example, like the sanitarian position, where you have all levels of government contributing to this one position, carrying out these program responsibilities. So I think it's true that we do have these positions that certainly do epitomize overlapping authority model of federalism. But to support his argument that we never had coordinated authority model and we've never had an era of dual federalism, he provides us with some other supporting information. So another supporting piece of information he provides for us is he says, let's look at all the attempts to what he calls unwind the system. So he said we had things like the Kestenbaum Commission. We had things such as the joint, what's it called, Joint Federal State Action Committee. We had all these different types of committees that were put together to try and sort out the relationships of federalism between the different levels of government. He said if we look specifically at the Joint Federal State Action Committee, we'll see that that action committee, despite working for over 2 years to identify programs, identified only 2 programs that should be turned over completely from the federal government to the state government. And then those 2 recommendations actually were never fully adopted and never put into law. So even though we put all this time and this effort into trying to unravel this overlapping federal system, we've never been successful at doing it because it's such an intricate overlapping of the functions between the different levels of government. He then tries to deal with the question of why. Why do we have this overlapping authority model of federalism? And his basic premise is that it's because we have a great fragmentation of power. So then he has to answer the question, why do we have such a fragmentation of power? And his argument is we have fragmentation of power in our system of federalism for a variety of reasons. One reason is that the states came first. So the states predated the national government. And since they predated the national government, they had this inherent authority, this inherent legitimacy before the national government even came into existence. And so since they existed first, obviously there's going to be a fragmentation of power, that some of that power is going to belong to those state governments. Secondly, he said there's a lot of distrust in this country for centralized power. We tend to trust our state and local governments more than we trust the national government. Now, I think in terms of critiquing that argument, there are some limitations to that. I think that when there is a natural disaster, like we saw with Hurricane Milton, one of the primary initial responses is, where is FEMA? Where is the FEMA money? Where is the money from the national government? I think we've really become preconditioned that when there's a natural disaster, we look immediately and first and foremost to the national government. Now, I just recently saw a story that FEMA is having trouble getting relief funds into some communities in North Carolina because of some of the interference that's being run by some militias in North Carolina. So maybe there is still a lot of that type of distrust. I think in terms of the discussions of the presidential election coming up and trust in the validity of the presidential election, I think you can still make an argument there's some distrust in the national government. But he says we typically in this country distrust centralization of power and distrust national governments. He said, third, people tend to have more pride in their states than they do in the national government. I think this was very true, certainly in the 1700s and the 1800s, that in the 1700s and 1800s, If you traveled abroad, you oftentimes identified yourself by your state. So you would say, I'm a New Yorker or I'm a Virginian. I don't know today if that's quite as true as it was in the past. I think most people traveling abroad identify themselves as Americans as opposed to Californians. So I don't know if it's as true today as in the past, but there has been a lot of this traditional pride in state and local governments. I think if you ever go to a state like Texas, you see a whole lot of that state pride from the moment you drive across the border. And there are huge Texas flags and God bless Texas everywhere across the state of Texas. My son's been working on his PhD at Baylor in Texas for the past 4 years. And I think he was really taken aback by how much Texas pride you oftentimes see in the state of Texas. He says another reason why we have this fragmentation of power is state wealth. He says that states really haven't had a lot of trouble generating revenue. And as opposed to a lot of other nations where you see regional governments that really struggle to support themselves, here in America, state and local governments really do generate some adequate revenue that can help support their own operations. And so that state wealth, those resources, provide them with the basis for having their own authority and their own power resource. And then he says states control elections. And we had talked about this before. If states control elections, obviously they can have a lot of sway in terms of representation in the Senate, representation in terms of the electors who are voting for the president in the Electoral College. He says fragmentation also comes from weak political parties. If you look at the political parties here in the US and compare them to the political parties in European countries, for the most part, our political countries are weaker. The upshot of our political parties being weaker means that administrators don't get the type of political party support that they would get in other countries, which means that administrators are far more involved in the political side of the equation in addition to the administrative side, which then fragments power even further. He says because of weak political parties, we see individual members of those parties, individual elected officials, in order to get reelected, they cannot rely upon their political party. They have to go out there and generate support among their constituents. How do they generate that support? By doing casework, by intervening in administrative issues on behalf of their constituents. If any of you have ever done any work for a member of a state legislature or even a city council, or certainly for a member of Congress, you know just how much time is devoted to doing this casework on the behalf of constituents. He says what this has created for us is it has created for us this multiple crack system. And one of the things that Morton Grodzins is best known for in the field of federalism is his theory of the multiple cracks. We, in our system of federalism, have fragmentation of power because of weak parties, because of all the things that we have talked about. That fragmentation creates all these cracks in the system. These are all multiple cracks that citizens can then exploit in order to get a redress of their grievances and to participate in politics and participate in their own self-governance. And so they will participate at the local level. They will participate at the state level. They will participate at the national level. And because of this multiple crack theory, you have more avenues for people to participate in politics at all levels of the process. That again fragments power, and according to Grodzins, explains why we have never been coordinated authority and why our system of federalism has always gravitated toward an overlapping authority model of federalism. I think if you look at our current system of federalism today, it's hard not to say it is an overlapping authority model. Now, for some issues, it's more inclusive authority. And so there are some issues where the national government really holds sway and centralizes decision-making. But for the most part, for most of our issues, programs and policies are delivered in this kind of relationship between national, state, and local governments, national, state, and local actors. So I think he's right that at least today, we are certainly very much in an overlapping authority type of model. So that's kind of what Morton Brodson's is telling us. We've always been overlapping. We've never been dual federalism. It's always been kind of this coordination, this kind of a relationship between all three levels of governments. And then to wrap up tonight, let's go to our final article. And that article then belongs to Sandra. So Sandra, let me go ahead and make you a co-host. And then in case you want to share slides. Now, you don't have to share slides. That's not a requirement, but that is something you can do.
Okay.
And let me see if I can find you. Oh my gosh. Give me a second. Oh, there you are. Takes me a second. All right. Make you a co-host. Yes. Okay. All right. I'll turn it over to you, Sandra, and the floor is yours.
All right. Let's see if I can get this working. I do have a slide, so you have something pretty to look at. Or maybe not pretty. I don't know. I didn't know how I do with my slides. Can you guys see it?
Yes, we can.
Okay,
Yeah,
great. Awesome. All right. So, yes, so the article I'll be covering is The Paradox of the Middle Tier by Martha Durthick. Just a quick background about the author. She explores, just as a high-level summary, she's exploring states' challenges and opportunities in the federal system, states being state government. It is an essay that comes from a book called Keeping the Compound Republic about America's federalism. And just as a note, in terms of what I talk about in dates, this was published in 2001. Martha Durthick was a former director of government studies at Brookings Institution, and she was a teacher, or sorry, a professor at the University of Virginia, and did some research and also taught at Harvard and Boston College early in her career, and has written several other books as well. All right, so let's just jump into what is the paradox. And she writes that states have a predicament, and it's kind of it's everything that Dr. Powell has discussed in all ways, that states have this predicament where they're a government that's on the rise, with responsibilities growing, but are inferior to Washington's orders. And when she says the word Washington, she means Congress, and that there's lack of resources to implement mandates from them. She also notes a few things that was discussed earlier today about the 10th Amendment. So, it's rights reserved to the states and the people, powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by the states are reserved for the states respectively or to the people. But states are inferior because of the Supremacy Clause, which she mentions, which we have just learned or looked at today about the Constitution ratifying in 1788 the Supremacy Clause, establishing a robust role for the federal government in managing the nation's affairs. And then invoking the clause to conclude that federal treaties and statutes supersede inconsistent state laws. So states are important and inferior at the same time, which is causing it to be self-contradictory. All right, and so I won't spend too much time on it because we've been learning and reviewing federalism, but federalism, again, is division and sharing of power between the national and state governments. She talks about different examples of how there's these paradoxical powers. To this day, it's still controversial of the boundary lines around Supreme Court rulings in favor of states over federal and vice versa. So this division of powers, and she goes over a history of states and dual federalism. So I don't want to spend too much time on it, but just as a recap, states were the first governments Dr. Powell, you just mentioned that moments ago in another article. Mediums and agents for creating other governments. At some point, they enjoyed autonomy, creating a framework of law within local governments. At the time, way back when, national government fought wars to secure existence, promote economic development with tariffs. And between state and feds, they were separate but equal sovereigns. And she gave some examples of this where there was this dual federalism. Civil War era case, Kentucky versus Denison, where federal government may not give commands to officers of the states. Collector versus Day, where the Supreme Court ruled in 1871 that federal government could not tax the salary of a county judge because he was a state officer. Civil rights cases in 1883 struck down congressional enactments regulating private conduct because they invaded in the domain of local jurisprudence. And Hammer versus Dagenhart ruled 1918 that Congress could not forbid the shipment in interstate commerce of the products of child labor because it used to invade state authority. So those were some examples that she gave. And then she goes in to talk about federalism transformations and transformations in late 19th century. I did my own research and I've nowhere included all the different federalisms that you've covered today, Dr. Powell. So there's cooperativism, which I noted, and new federalism. But what I wanted to then ask is, does anyone have a thought about, what type of federalism do you think we're in now? I know that you have covered the contextual, but does anyone have any other theories around another name that we could be utilizing to consider for today? And if not, that's all right. It's late. All right, so let's talk about the middle tier. So states, even though they maybe are the ones to start off and are in charge of creating local governments, they're really in the middle. So they're kind of like the middle child, taking orders from Washington, but also having to supervise local governments and also raising revenues. So there are challenges and opportunities for states being from the middle tier. Just this is very high level budgets, infrastructure, public health, healthcare, technology, privacy, education, and crime. Can anyone provide any examples of what you would say would be a challenge for states being in the middle tier or an opportunity?
I could try to speak to it.
Sure.
I think that one of the challenges for states being in the middle tier is trying to enact federal initiatives, using federal funding and acting as the pass-through and sending down mandates to local governments. One example I can think of for the city that I work for is new affordable housing mandates that are getting passed down from the feds to the state, that are requiring cities to develop large amounts of affordable housing. But, at the administration level, there's a lot more consideration to be, at play because, we have to consider all of the potential repercussions, and not just financially, but, at like a roads usage and utility usage level, that, maybe is not as considered on the higher level. So I think that one challenge for the state that we're working with now is, trying to communicate these concerns at the local level, that don't really necessarily get thought of at the macro level, where you're saying that housing per se is an issue, but at what cost are we coming up with a solution, if that makes sense?
Yeah, and that's a fantastic example.
I was gonna give another example as well.
Yeah.
I was gonna say something that Los Angeles benefits from is like federal and state grants to address issues like infrastructures, healthcare, Medicaid, disaster relief like FEMA, and education. The city often has like to match or manage these funds in partnerships with state and federal guidelines.
Yes. Those are all the great examples. And infrastructure definitely is a big one. State and local governments, and I have information that's from 2023, spend roughly half a trillion dollars annually on transportation and water infrastructure, with about one quarter paid for through grants from federal government. And then also challenges, some opportunities some people feel are that states can manage things more closely. So there's an example of back in Michigan, there was an avian flu emergency order requiring dairy farms and poultry operations to develop biosecurity practices. And that was something they were able to manage, supervise, and ensure, but that's not something that federally or across the nation could happen. They did receive federal funding to help out with that, and were able to combat that. So, on a smaller level, the states had some opportunities being in that middle tier. Any other examples?
I have one.
Yeah.
So I think it's kind of relevant to the case study that we did, and I forget for which one. It was the one about water, and it was specifically about how in like the southern southwest portion of the United States, we had an ongoing drought, right? And we knew that the Colorado River supplies had to be managed, but also like the challenge for states is that they had to like comply and work with the other states to be able to like claim their share of the water, but also being respectful of the greater good for everyone. And I almost feel like it would probably be easier for the the federal government to like step in and give rules, but I think it's challenging for the states to be able to come up with a plan when they only have so much power and jurisdiction over their own state. So I think that's kind of like it's kind of like you have power, but you don't have as much power as you may need to influence some change for your people.
Yes. Fantastic. Yes, those are all great examples of the challenges, the opportunities, and that paradox that Martha's talking about. And she covers a section around what she calls mismatches in modern federalism. And I put in quotes in 2001 because her perception of things is from a long time ago. For me, that was a long time ago. Um, some things are the same, some things may be different. So between prescription and practicality, she finds that's a mismatch. Between locus of responsibility for generating public benefits and for paying costs, between locus of responsibility for defining public goals and for making trade-offs among them. Um, she even goes along to say, like, they should have a voice and they should be able to push back in some cases. She's saying that state governments converted to national administrative agents, enforcing laws that do not suit the circumstances of their societies. And federalism doesn't determine Congress's behavior. It's an interesting take. So again, she really feels like states should have a voice. She does not think that they're responding assertively. She even says that, the response to some things where they're being mandated to implement a law but not given the resources, that they should say, "Are you kidding me?" That's a quote that she has. So having a voice on behalf of policy objectives they articulate. So at the time, she felt like that's not something that they had. And I did a little note about like, is some quick research about any analysis around that. And it was noted there's little analysis on how states respond to federal mandates, other than what we see in the various different articles, modern articles that are out there now. All right, so do you think states have a voice and a power? So back then she says no. Yes, no, maybe. Do they have a voice? Do they have power? And in most recent times, does anyone have any thoughts? Yes.
I'll chime in on this one, Sandra. I think it depends on the state leaders and whether or not their politics align with the federal level. Because you know, like for example, you got an administration that's fairly liberal, and then you have some states who are more right-leaning, and obviously their messages or their ideologies are always going to clash. And I think more so now than before. So having a voice is one thing, but like actually exerting influence, I think it all depends on the alignment of the political agenda, basically.
Yeah, that makes sense. Kind of going back to the contextual piece of it. Um, an example I pulled from Plural Policy. Many state laws now conflict with federal law on the topic of marijuana or cannabis. And so, yes, depending on how the politics are, yes, maybe they have a voice and they decide how they want to enact that, and others can decide no. Let's see, does anyone else have their hands up? Chris.
Yeah, I think like when we think about the Electoral College, I feel like states that have a higher number and that have bigger sway in the vote, right? So like for example, California and Texas, I would have more power than a smaller state would. So I think in that regard, when it comes to like presidential elections, states have definitely have a voice and power in that, especially the size of them.
Yep, that's a good example. And do you think federalism and the current climate is it effective? Are states is what we're this like imbalance or balance of powers, is it effective for moving things? Anyone have any thoughts on that? Do you think it's sustainable? Like how we're moving? Let's see, who else? Amanda.
I mean, I think in a way it kind of acts like in the same way like we have multiple branches within the federal government, like as a way of balancing things out, like so that, because there's some things that the federal government, things need to be kind of like on a state by state basis. Like, yes, we have a federal minimum wage, but obviously the federal minimum wage doesn't really apply to, like, you couldn't apply that in California. Like, I don't, no one can live in California on the federal minimum wage. So I think it's like, and not necessarily that it's effective. Like, I think it's clear that there's, in similar ways, like the way our government is right now, where you have an executive that might be more liberal, but then, like, I think they always mix up House and Senate, but where like one side is more conservative, so nothing really gets done because you kind of have that balance. And I think that kind of extrapolates out to like the country as a whole in terms of our like federalism structure of states having power and the federal government. So I feel like it is helpful in that way, but definitely not necessarily always effective. And then obviously the more like factionalism, or at least the feeling of being factionalized there is, probably leads to less effectiveness. So I don't really know how you fix that necessarily, but I think that's kind of how that works.
Yeah. All right. Well, that pretty much ends my review of that article. I guess the last thing is just do any of you have any critiques for Martha or alternative thoughts about what she's saying? Any solutions? I think it's tough. I do think she gave good examples, although all of her examples, interestingly, were like from a long time ago. But there's plenty of current and past examples of the tension and the paradox that she's talking about, and whether or not that's right or wrong. I mean, I don't have an answer to that myself. Did anyone have any opinions? And I appreciate everyone who's responded. Thank you. I know it's the end of the night, so thank you. I'll just leave it with that then. Think about the critique and what your thoughts are. And that's it.
Great. Perfect. Thank you, Sandra. Very well done. And you're right. And with some of the articles, they are a little bit older. And so it is important that we make them a little bit more contemporary with some more modern examples. So I really appreciate that you did that. And thank you for everyone who participated. The mismatches, that's really what jumps out at me from the Durthick article. And I think she's right. That it does create these mismatches between, like she says, prescription and practicality. And so it's really easy for the national government to say, we're going to pass this policy, this approach, because it's going to help us. It's going to help us get reelected because, as David Mayhew tells us, the primary motivation of every member of Congress is to get reelected. And so it'll help their reelection prospects, but they don't think a lot about, well, what's the reality of it on the ground that's in state and local governments? And an example of that I'm familiar with is the No Child Left Behind Act. And the No Child Left Behind Act had these prescriptions of, as we had mentioned before, that you had to reach 100% proficiency for all of your subgroups of your population of students. Well, that's the prescription. And that certainly sounds really good on paper, but any statistician will tell you that it is practically impossible to get 100%. It's simply not going to happen, especially with all of your different subpopulations of students. And so it's not going to happen. And so the practicality that local school districts were dealing with was just that you can't do it. It's not possible to be at 100%. Sounds good at the national level, but where the rubber meets the road at the state and local level, it just doesn't work. And I think sometimes the national government's a little bit out of touch with what we actually do at the local level of government and doesn't really understand why some of these things just are not possible to get done at the local level. And I do think also, this whole idea is a fascinating one of state governments as this middle tier. As Sandra talked about, it's this paradox that, they came first, they were created first, and you would think that they'd be able to effectively push back on these attempts by the national government to erode their authority and their sovereignty. But there are some inherent limitations that are built into being a state government. One of those limitations is that you have 50 different state governments. These 50 different state governments oftentimes get into turf battles with each other. You always see as you're driving down the freeway, you may see those billboards saying, come to the state of Colorado, move your business to Colorado. We have very low business taxes and, we'll give tax abatements and all that good stuff. I know that I've been seeing more and more commercials for the state of Ohio and how Ohio is the place to do business. So Ohio is competing directly with California for their corporate property tax base. So whenever you have these states that are competing against each other, it makes it difficult for them to join together and then have a unified front to push back on these national government efforts. And because they all have their different opinions, their different vested interests. That's a theme that we're going to pick up on next week when we move into the political aspects of federalism. And there's one article I think no one signed up for, so I think I'll be covering that one. And that's the Ann Ohm Bowman article that looks at different ways in which states tend to cooperate with each other. And there are some states that are very willing to cooperate with other states to push back on the national government. There are other states that don't want to cooperate whatsoever with any other states. There are some states that like to cooperate in terms of compacts. There are some states that want to cooperate in terms of multi-state legal agreements and all those different types of approaches. And so it's a very idiosyncratically specific response that states have to federal government intervention. And it's not that there is one state government agenda. There's not. There are 50 different state government agendas. And that does make it very difficult for the states at this middle tier to push back on the top tier of the national government. So, and we'll get more into that next week. Let me just quickly, before we are done tonight, though, if I have it on here, share out our spreadsheet. So we can take a look at what we are doing next week, which articles and who is doing what. So for the 21st, we move into the political articles and we have governments as interest groups. The Camissa article, I believe that one is Chris's article. Then we have the trends in interstate cooperation, Ann Bowman, and if no one signs up for that, I will do that one. Then we have the ways of achieving federal objectives, another Derthick article, and that one belongs to Alfonso. And then the final article that we'll cover next week is the DeWitt article, Beyond Preemption. We'll get into this issue of preemption, what it is, and how states have tried to push back on full as well as partial preemption. And if no one signs up for it, I will then do that article. So those are the four main articles that we'll be discussing next week in our discussion of the political aspects of federalism and intergovernmental relations. Please do remember to do that first discussion board posting, number one. Have all your posts done then by midnight next Sunday, and then we'll be back at it talking about politics, 6 p.m. next Monday. Okay? Any questions or last observations or anything before we call it an evening? All right, otherwise, that's week number one, and we'll be back at next Monday. I hope everyone has a great week. If you have any questions between now and then, feel free to email me. Otherwise, I will see you next Monday. So take care and have a great week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Bye. Good night.
Good night.